Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this morning's dialogue focusing on South Africa's foreign policy future under the new government of national unity. My name is Priyal Singh, and I will be facilitating this morning's discussions. We are privileged to be joined this morning by a very esteemed panel of speakers who really do not need any introduction, as they are some of the leading minds on foreign policy and Africa's international relations. And they are, of course, Professor Cheryl Hendricks, who's joining us, who's the Executive Director from the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, Professor Gilbert Khadiagala, Professor Emeritus and Director of the Center for the Study of the United States at the University of the Witwatersrand, as well as Mr. Moletsi Mbeki, who is the National Chairman of the South African Institute for International Affairs, who will serve as a respondent and who will be joining us on the line. For those joining us online, I'd just like to make clear that Chatham House rules do not apply to this event, as this event is being live streamed on YouTube and Facebook, and will of course also be archived on our websites. Colleagues, before our panel discussion, however, I'd like to first welcome our Executive Director, Dr. Fonteh Akum, who is the Executive Director at the Institute for Security Studies, to provide opening remarks and set the stage for our discussion this morning. Fonteh, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priyal. Distinguished panelists, dear participants, here and online, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning. Great, we are all here. It's my utmost pleasure to welcome you to this convening on South Africa's foreign policy future under the government of national unity. And it's taking place just one day after the swearing in of the new cabinet, and His Excellency Ronald Lamola takes the reins as the Minister of International Relations and Cooperation in a cabinet where he would be deputized by Mrs. Alvin Butters and Ms. Thandi Moraka. In terms of context, this seventh cabinet is coming into government in an inherently divided world where South Africa has traditionally the capacity to significantly combine its economic, geographical, mediating capacity, and moral agency for Africa and in the world. Though it's often sort of apostasy to speak of South African foreign policy in power terms, all of these actually amount to a degree of smart power capabilities that South Africa can actually deploy to address some of the challenges that it faces at home, but also to chart a foreign policy which speaks not just for South Africa, but Africa on the global stage. Though it's interesting to look at the global context, it's also useful for us in looking forward to actually take a look back in retrospective as well. South Africa's foreign policy machinery has demonstrated a presence on all of the major issues of our time, from conflict to climate, from pandemics to the reform of the multilateral system. However, to bring things back here at home, while South Africa's continental leadership on emergency COVID response and recovery has been met with consensus across the political spectrum, there have been a number of divisive issues as well. Its stance and actions on the war in Ukraine and Gaza have been the bone of contention among the biggest winners of the May 29 elections in the country, the African National Congress and the Democratic Alliance. The key question then is how a government of national unity actually charts a coherent foreign policy going forward. We can also table issues relating to South Africa's role as a continental mediator. And we saw South Africa as the key mediator of the peace cessation of hostilities agreement on Ethiopia. But there is also the issue of South Africa's recent deployments in Mozambique and in the Democratic Republic of Congo as part of a SADC mission. The framework document on South Africa's national interest and its advancement in the global environment provide a solid basis for the continuation of South Africa's progressive foreign policy, with priorities such as national sovereignty and constitutional order, safety and the well-being of its citizens, economic prosperity, and a better Africa and the world. And it's not lost on us that a lot of those priorities actually also align with the second 10-year implementation plan of Agenda 2063. So there is already coherence in that space. This convening seeks to provide a platform for an exchange on some of the fundamentals, particularly against the backdrop of South Africa's looming presidency of the G20. We need to interrogate whether the parties represented in the Government of National Unity can navigate their foreign policy differences. And the key question is how they succeed in doing that. And it's not lost on us that looking at the composition of the government itself and the executive prerogatives in foreign policy, a lot of the conversations would remain largely within the African National Congress. However, given the fact that South Africa has operated its foreign policy in an integrated manner, we would also see a huge role for different elements, different segments within the government as well to contribute to the process. Secondly, how does South Africa, through a government of national unity, maintain its leadership on the continent and a leading voice on Africa in the world? Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, thank you again to the panelists for honoring us with their presence, both here and online, and I look forward to a robust conversation. Thank you.
So colleagues, what we'll do is we'll jump straight into the panel discussion. Prof. Hendricks and Prof. Khadiagala, what I'd like to do here is to really explore some of your views and perspectives through two sets of interventions from the both of you for around 10 minutes each, before giving the floor to Mr. Mbeki, who is, of course, joining us online as a respondent. Following this, we will then open up the floor to the audience to receive questions from our online audience, who Khadiagala, my colleague, will be providing us, as well as anyone from our in-person audience here as well. Once again, I should mention, Chatham House rules do not apply this morning. This is being live streamed on YouTube and Facebook. So again, for members of the audience, please be mindful of this. And please do keep yourselves muted and your videos off up until I call on you to provide questions. With that bit of housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to first turn to our first speaker, Prof. Hendricks, to get your views. And Prof, I know both of you have academic tendencies and you'd like to lecture us at the podium. If you'd like, you're more than you can do that. Otherwise, please feel free and we can have a discussion here. But Prof. Hendricks, I think, building on the comments made by Fonteh now, I'd like to get your views on how, if at all, this new governance arrangements that we have with the GNU may materially impact foreign policy making in South Africa. And I'd be particularly interested in getting your views on, the potential pitfalls or opportunities or challenges that the seventh administration may need to pay particular attention to over the coming years, given the fact that we are in uncharted territory with this new governance arrangements. Prof, over to you.
Thank you, Priyal, and thank you to the ISS for shifting our discussion on the GNU also to look at particular issues. I think that that's become important. But I think we can't just jump into that. We actually do need to step back a little bit and ask, how did we get here and what is this that we have that is called a GNU, and then how it will most probably impact foreign policy. And as you said, this is completely uncharted waters for South Africa. First time that the ANC is not the sole governing party here. But I think this didn't come as a surprise. That's the first point I want to make. The polls were saying for a very long time, prior to the election, that the ANC would get under 50%. So they would have been thinking about what their response should be if that was to be the case. And I do recall that in August 2023, there was actually at UWC a big meeting with all the political parties on governments of national unity. So there already they thought about coalitions. The DA almost immediately after that, in the same August, came up with the, what was it called, multi-charter. Multi-party charter. Earlier that here they've been speaking about the Moonshot Pact. So this idea of forming a coalition, some kind of government of national unity, has been on the cards for quite some time already. But the election results took us by surprise, no doubt about that. And I think firstly because the MK emerged, garnering 15% of the vote, because the ANC dropped by such a huge margin, 17%, and because the DA didn't seem to grow at all, even though it had the rhetoric of rescuing South Africa, that it was going to be the particular party that could chart us on the road of rationality rather than fundamentalism, which is what they like to say. And because the country, and I think this is the important point, is tired of the old order, but moving towards populism. Because it's 26%. If you count MK and EFF and PA together, we can't just dismiss this by a government of national unity. We've got to take this particular positioning of South Africans seriously and how that will most probably shift us in terms of international relations. Once the election results were announced, the ANC pulled out of its hat the government of national unity. Okay, so here we go again. This is 1994, and this is what the ANC has been preaching over the last 30 years for all other countries that have been in conflict. And now the rhetoric, both by the ANC and by the DA, is this is the will of the people. The voters told us we must be doing this. Did they really? Hey? The voters voted, okay, and most probably out of frustration and insufficient trust, and it gave us this particular result. And so another point I want to make here before I get to foreign policy is what is the ANC doing here? Is this a genuine attempt at government of national unity, or is this just a repositioning of itself, biding a bit of time before it then comes to the fore? So it rolled out the statement of intent, a post-election agreement, the DA had a pre-election agreement, and when it did so, the markets reacted favorably to that. We saw the rand-dollar exchange become more positive. Now, if we look at the cabinet positioning there, and I just want to make this point and then I'll answer you, it is quite uncanny. I mean, we look at the DA and how it's reacting, but there's something quite real about what they're saying. Because the ANC got 40% of the vote and 62% of cabinet positions. So it actually did not lose out at all. Yeah, but it does have to govern differently, and this is where you want us to be. And so the first is by signing that agreement of intent, all political parties actually already agreed to the broad contours of the foreign policy, right? Because it says that it will be based on human rights, constitutionalism, the national interest, solidarity, peaceful resolution of conflicts, South-South cooperation, and the like. We have the Minister of International Relations, Ronald Lamola, ANC, was very much in the forefront on Palestine and taking Israel to the International Court of Justice. So we'll see continuity there. And unlike in the other ministries, the two deputy ministers are also ANC. So a lot of continuity we're going to be seeing. The ANC's manifesto itself, and it's the only party in its manifesto that actually speaks to foreign policy. None of the other political parties speak to this issue. And it outlines much of what we know already: build a better Africa, build a better world, promote peace and security, peace diplomacy, African Continental Free Trade Agreement, all of the things that we know it pushes in relation to a South-South agenda, progressive internationalism, and Pan-Africanism. What I'm saying is that it actually has a bit of free rein around foreign policy. The others have not been thinking about this. They've been concentrated on migration, if anything. And luckily for us, the PA did not get the Ministry of Home Affairs. Okay, so I don't think there's much of a challenge there. However, there are party divergences. BRICS, with a new configuration of BRICS, it will pose challenges for the political party alliances, especially for a DA centrist position there. I don't think when we get to opportunities, because we haven't really as a country sat down and spoken about, okay, what does this mean for us in relation to BRICS? What does this mean in relation to our broader South-South cooperation? Even this document of national interest, it was largely drafted by DIRCO. There was not a national conversation around this. And so we're speaking about a national dialogue. The opportunity is there for us now, for South Africans to input into what our foreign policy should be. The making of foreign policy is largely a presidential prerogative here. It will remain as such. It will be pushed from our presidency. We're moving towards the summit of the future now. What is our position going into the summit of the future? There are key questions that we need to be asking. The opportunity that this government of national unity, if it holds, is to present South Africans more broadly with an opportunity to engage on foreign policy. I see a lot of continuity happening in relation to foreign policy. Much more discussion will have to happen in Parliament with the other parties, because they will now also be far more represented in your portfolio committees, etc. And so, yeah, broadly, I think if the government of national unity holds, because there also also around that, continuity for me.
Well, thank you, Prof. I think before I go to Prof. Khadiagala, maybe just one question to you, Prof. Hendricks. You've mentioned the stability of the GNU, right? That is front and center of all the parties to the GNU. They want it to be stable, sustainable, and effective. But there is a pressure, internal pressure within that grouping, party-specific pressures to exert influence in particular policy domains. Would you agree with the assertion that, given the party affiliation of the newly appointed minister and the deputy ministers, would you agree that foreign policy would be largely ring-fenced to the ANC, and that this principle of sufficient consensus and that is so central to the GNU and its functioning may not be as big of an issue, given the fact that we have a party-affiliated minister who is basically ring-fencing this and saying this is our policy domain. Other parties to the GNU have their own particular priorities within the GNU.
So I largely agree with that assertion. I think for the DA, it is trade and industry that is important. They got the deputy minister position. They wanted to have the ministry position. But I think that the ANC and DA are more or less aligned on trade and foreign investment there. I think one other institution or portfolio is defense. And so it was interesting in terms of the Minister and Deputy Minister of Defense. Everybody has been going on about Angie, but they have placed QDM there. He's a military person. And his focus is more on the national interest. When you hear him speak, it's on the national interest. And I don't think he has the same understanding about that national interest as the ANC hood. Now, the defense is the implementing arm of our foreign policy. When you speak about peacekeeping, etc., that's defense. And the capacities in defense really are wanting. Everybody has been speaking about this for years. So here, another opportunity, I guess, is we need to upskill in both defense and in DIRCO, recapacitate. Will we get this with this government of national unity?
Thank you, Prof. Prof. Khadiagala, turning to you, based on the comments that have been made so far, and of course noting that we are still very much in early days with the GNU, much is still yet to be determined on how this government functions with respect to foreign policy. But I'd just like to get your thoughts, Prof, on what do you believe are some of the biggest elements on the horizon for continuity and change that the seventh administration that will afflict or present themselves to the seventh administration over the coming years? I think, as Prof. Hendricks just mentioned, the broad contours of South African foreign policy look like they would largely be in place, but we cannot deny that this new governance arrangement may actually go in multiple different directions over the coming months, let alone years. So, Prof, just to get your thoughts on some of the key issues in terms of continuity and change in our international relations over the next 5 years.
Thank you again for the invitation. I think I need to start with the nature of coalition governments. Coalition governments are by definition anchored on compromises, on discussions, on negotiations. And these are really ongoing, these are very permanent processes. So it will be interesting to see how the compromises are going to filter into foreign policy. And here I disagree a little bit with Cheryl on the issue around the GNU. I mean, there are other ministries like trade that have a lot of impact on foreign policy. So they will have to negotiate with these other ministers, apart from just, foreign policy, because foreign policy is actually largely these days very economic policy. So what is the nature of those negotiations? How are they going to come up? What are the compromises the ministers will have to make, or the government within the GNU will have to make in addressing some of these issues? Even foreign affairs would have to begin to talk to home affairs on the issues of migration and so on. So I see, therefore, a much broad-based discussion within the GNU on the very nature of foreign policy, particularly since, as I said, foreign policy encompasses so many areas. But the other issue that I want to say here is that 30 years of ANC's foreign policy making has brought us to where we are today. And therefore, the opportunity for a coalition government, to me, is essentially the opportunity to reset the foreign policy making context. In fact, the content of foreign policy, so that we have, or South Africa has a foreign policy that is reflective of what I'm calling the broad-based constituencies within the country. Because we've had really what I'm calling a monolithic foreign policy, defined in documents, the white and the blue papers around foreign policy. But I think it's a good opportunity to have coalition partners, particularly through Parliament, sitting together and saying we need to agree on a national interest-based foreign policy. Not a question of the kinds of friendships you forged over the years, the kinds of alliances that sometimes I think interrupt what I'm calling the national interest, because it has never really been clearly defined across the board. It is a party that took power and came up to frame not just economic policy, but also foreign policy. So this is a good opportunity. And I think the other opportunity, you have a new minister. There's a big difference, I think, just in style, in tenure between the two, Lady Panda and Lamola, although we haven't seen him really in foreign policy except for the ICJ. But a new minister also gives us an opportunity really to begin to look at foreign policy through different eyes. So the policy may not fundamentally change, but I think we need, or at least that change at the ministerial level. I think you mentioned the other two, the deputy ministers, they may still be ANC, but I think it's just important that we have a new face in foreign policy. So that will give us a different sets of eyes and ears in the foreign policy arena. And then the other point I think I wanted to make is that there's going to be more continuity within change. So I see on the African horizon, the policy about Africa, South Africa's leadership of Africa is going to remain very constant. But I see some changes in precisely the places you mentioned, the interventions in places like the DRC, the places like Mozambique, even though that's being wound down. But I don't think they're doing very well in the DRC. And it ties in with what you just talked about on the capacity of the military really to show its strength, particularly in places as complex as the Eastern DRC. So there's going to be broader continuity in the African positions, but I see some nuances coming up, particularly probably rethinking some of these interventions. I see also more South African leadership around the African Union, something we haven't seen since the Mbeki days. I think they have taken a very lukewarm, lackluster position when it comes to the critical issues around the AU, even on the coming issue next year on who is going to be the new AU chair. We don't see South Africa in those debates, but I can understand why. But I'm saying there's need for more leadership of those institutions. I also see more leadership, I think, on issues like SADC, again, which has fallen off, I think, as a foreign policy issue. It is not as prominent as it used to be. On BRICS, I think the expansion, you're correct, the expansion of membership in BRICS is going to present challenges to South Africa because the bigger the BRICS, therefore the more, the lesser power, the lesser influence South Africa would have. I think that influence was lost, or rather the best time to exercise it was last year, when South Africa did lead the call for the expansion. But now when you have more countries coming onto the BRICS, I think there's going to be a slight shift in how South Africa actually looks at BRICS. But I think the other important thing that I suspect is going to be dominant here is that they are going to play a bigger role in BRICS, but they are not going to be overexposed. I don't think the coalition government would want to be overexposed to agendas such as de-dollarization that was very prominent under the previous government. So these are important things because de-dollarization is also linked to what is the posture towards the West and the United States in particular. So AGOA debates, of course, fit in very well into it. So I see the muting of this kind of the rhetorical languages within BRICS. So South Africa would be a normal member of BRICS, but not too overextended to the Russian and the Chinese agenda. On issues such as the Gaza conflict, I think there's more continuity there. Also because there is really nothing new to present on the table. They put the case to the ICJ and we are waiting for the ICJ to make the decision. So I don't think the new minister would want to continue ratcheting up the pressure on Israel at this point. It's just, I think, more prudent to take a step back and say we have some victory there because the ICJ is running with the case, rather than being continually overexposed to the issue around the Gaza-Israel, Palestine-Israel issue. So let me stop here for now.
Thank you very much, Prof. And maybe just a quick question before I go back to Prof. Hendricks. Going back to your first point on the coalition governance, the nature of this coalition government. Prof, you know, as the think tank community, the academic community, the broader policy community in South Africa, where should we be looking for lessons from coalition governance? Are there lessons, are there key cases maybe from the African continent, from the global south, that we could be looking at to get some idea of how this kind of raucous politicking within these coalition governance arrangements may actually impact foreign policy or impact international relations?
I think the best example of a GNU is the 1990s GNU, which was crafted here for a purpose. It was time-bound. This is much longer, 5 years, so not very clear whether 5 years is too long for a GNU. But I think in the rest of Africa, I don't think there are many cases of GNUs, because what you have there is essentially one-party dominant states. And they don't really they have never had opportunity. There was an opportunity in Kenya in 2007, 2013, but that was also a very exceptional case because it came out of a near civil war. So I would think that the best model is the model of the early 90s in South Africa that was time-bound, but it had very clear objectives of what they wanted to achieve. That is, I think, the best framework that we should be looking at, even though the circumstances have changed, but I think the parties are still very much the same individuals, even though they are in different, or they come in different colors.
Oh, no, sir. Thank you, Prof. Prof. Hendricks, turning back to you, and I think building on that question, but also building on some of your earlier comments around the broader foreign policy establishments in South Africa. So beyond DIRCO, also looking at Department of Defense, for example, like you mentioned, but I think also looking maybe at the Office of the Presidency, party-specific structures focusing on foreign policy, like the ANC's NEC Subcommittee on International Relations, the National Assembly's Portfolio Committee on International Relations. I'd like to get your views on this broader foreign policy making establishments, these nodes of foreign policy making within South Africa. How do you think the working relationships between these structures may change? And I ask that question given the fact that, again, we are in uncharted territory. We don't have a dominant, outright dominance of the ANC anymore, which means that, for the first time, structures like the NEC committee, the ANC's NEC Committee on International Relations, may actually have to have some very difficult conversations with party-specific structures from other parties, even though, like you said, some of them may not have elaborate foreign policy plans or whatnot. However, they will have to engage with these world views from the DA, from even Front Plus, for example. How do you think this kind of these interrelationships amongst these different nodes may change and influence foreign policy over the coming years?
I think Prof Khadiagala hinted at it. There will be change in the continuity because they will need to go and negotiate some of these stances that they would want to undertake. But you know what? And I want to bring us back to MK and EFF because they are in Parliament. And so I'm not too worried about the NEC of the ANC. Lamola is a member of that International Relations Committee, if I'm not mistaken. So there'd be continuity there. But they do have to go back to Parliament to negotiate some of these issues. We have in the sixth administration, and I like this, now we begin to emphasize seventh administration. We never spoke about fifth and sixth administration, but there's an emphasis on the seventh administration. But in the sixth administration, if I may call it that, there was a definite attempt to reset South Africa in terms of international relations, our leadership on particular issues, way more emphasis on peace diplomacy as opposed to just economic diplomacy that would have characterized the fifth administration under Zuma. So we actually saw that happening with emphasis on Palestine, Ukraine, African Peace Initiative, going into northern Mozambique, the changes happening in DRC, etc. So we would want to continue with this. But this is not the emphasis of the other political parties who are much more domestically focused. And that's where the tension is going to come in, because these are resource issues. These are about priority issues. Now, yeah, EFF and MK, I think, would be much more aligned to progressive internationalism, to Pan-Africanism, etc., than the other political parties. So you might find that the ANC would have to be courting them in Parliament more than the other two. So I think it's going to make for interesting dynamics coming through there. I want to get us back to the national dialogue, because I think we are not too focused on this. We are focused on this thing called the GNU. If the GNU is going to succeed, we have to have that dialogue that emphasizes what are the principles, what are the priorities, how are we going to resolve those priorities, because that's where the disagreement is, not on what the priorities are, but how to resolve them. On values and ethics and behavior, because those are some of our challenges here. And so, and us as broader civil society, population, engaging also on what our foreign policy should be. That's going to be the difference here.
No, thank you, Prof. And, you know, maybe I'll just go straight over again to Prof. Khadiagala. And, you know, like Prof. Hendricks has just mentioned, we never really spoke about the sixth and the fifth and the fourth administrations in much detail. But we're looking at the GNU and the seventh administration in a different way, in a very different way. Our framing and our kind of preliminary analysis of what they are doing is actually framed from a different angle, if I can call it that. And Prof, I think, you know, going beyond the internal dynamics we have at play within our national dialogue, like Prof. Hendricks said, going beyond the GNU and all of these internal issues, I think, you know, we should also remain cognizant that the form and the function of our foreign policy over the next 5 years, the form of our foreign policy over the next 5 years is also a function of the broader geopolitical environments in which it must operate and which it must evolve. As we've discussed, certain parties to the GNU may hold maybe not differing opinions on broad foreign policy, but certainly have very different, diametrically opposed positions or views on specific issues, very specific issues. So, Prof, I think, you know, given the state of the world right now, given these deepening geopolitical tensions that are playing out, where South Africa positions itself in the world, the expansion of BRICS, and you know, all of these big issues, what are your views on some of the big ticket priority issues or developments that the seventh administration should pay attention to in this broader external environment as our foreign policy adapts and evolves to this new system?
The global environment currently is in flux and in a very dangerous directions, I would say. I think we are seeing Europe, for instance, the rise of right-wing regimes that are going to have a big impact on how Europe looks at the world. We are going to go more into the fortress Europe than we've actually ever seen. The other thing to flag is the American election that is going to come up, very uncertain, but some clarity now that maybe Biden may not stand. But that's really very complex picture, but everybody's talking about the second Trump era. And that is going to be a very dangerous era. So that rightward shift, particularly among the big powers, or rather the Western powers, obviously has an impact on how South Africa positions itself, particularly in issues around the UN, almost everything, because that's shaped by the posture of the West, of Europe, and so on. But the other big point is that geopolitically, the war in Ukraine doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon. You remember that South Africa was very critical to the mediation of that conflict at some point last year. And that just fizzled out because I don't think the Russians are interested in a negotiated settlement to that war. What that means is that if there's no peaceful end to that conflict, it's going to fester for a while, but it's also going to affect South African foreign policy broadly, because you still have to deal, that issue keeps coming up in all these forums. But the other big issue, as you mentioned, is the expansion of BRICS. And I think Putin is now talking about 10 additional members, if he can get them through the coming summit. So that's going to be quite an interesting. So South Africa, and I think it was mentioned by Fonteh or by you when you said that it has a very good position to use its smart power. It can still rise up like it rose up in the early 90s under Mandela to say, you know, we are an emerging power, but I think we can make a difference when it comes to these big global events. So that leadership is not lost. That possibility of leadership, particularly where you have a polarized world, is a good position for South Africa then to play a big role. And I think you mentioned the G21 meeting next year, hosting it. And of course, the AU is there, the 1+20. So it is important that, in fact, South Africa takes that seriously, because it's going to, in fact, return South Africa to the international scene under a new administration. So, in fact, it will be a good opportunity for it to begin to restate what its position globally is. And you mentioned to the Summit of the Future, which is in September. So it's actually a better opportunity for Lamola to present what you call the draft South Africa's position to the world, using that forum. So yes, there are problems. I think there are issues that foreign policy makers will have to keep flagging. But again, I think there are more opportunities than problems coming forward, than constraints going forward.
Certainly, Prof. I think, all of us, I think would agree that South Africa re-emerged on the international stage post-94 with this extremely deep reservoir of political capital that it could use. But questions, I think, especially over the last decade, was, are we smartly using that reservoir of political capital? How are we deploying that political capital to navigate the world? And I think those are questions that will become acutely prominent during this seventh administration again. And colleagues, with that said, I'd like to now turn to Mr. Moletsi Mbeki, who's joining us online as a respondent. Mr. Mbeki, based on the interventions from Professors Hendricks and Khadiagala, what do you make of this new governance arrangements? I know you've written some very interesting thought pieces just in this past week, and also on the potential impact of this new governance arrangements on South Africa's international relations over the coming 5 years. Mr. Mbeki, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, and thank you to everybody, and good morning to everybody. And I must say special good morning to Vladimir Shubin, an old friend of the people of South Africa. In Russia, he gave us, of course, as you know, in the Soviet era, we got enormous support from his country, and he was one of the leaders of the process of supporting South Africa. So you're welcome. It's good to see that you are still interested in South Africa. I agree with the two presenters that there's continuity in terms of foreign policy. There's going to be continuity in terms of of foreign policy, partly because all the other parties, as has been pointed out, really in their manifestos were not interested in the issues of foreign affairs and foreign relations. There was a bit of backtracking by the EFF about its open borders, that South Africa must open its borders to everybody from Africa. But beyond that, there was very little interest in foreign policy. But of course, the ANC being the government, and with its history of long involvement with the international community in the struggle against apartheid, foreign policy has always been an important part of the ANC, going way back to the founding of the Pan-African Congress by Du Bois at the beginning of the 20th century, and the ANC was a member of the founding of the Organization of African Unity. It was actually a full member of COMESA, the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa. Oliver Tambo sat in the heads of state meeting of COMESA as a full member. So the ANC has a long history and it mobilized very successfully the international community against apartheid. So foreign policy is second nature to the ANC, and I think it will continue. It will continue to be so. However, I think there was a question raised, which I think is very important, which is South Africa's leadership role on the African continent, which to me should be a priority for South Africa. And the ANC government has failed dismally in that department. There was a book published a few years ago by the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London called South Africa's Continental Role. It's called Africa's Lost Leader. That is the title of the book. Africa's Lost Leader, South Africa's Continental Role Since Apartheid. And this book points out that for a country to become a leader in Africa, and I quote here, the country would have had to view itself as a hegemon and be prepared to assert a strong claim to African leadership, acquire sufficient material power to make its hegemonic aspirations credible, as well as the ability to translate that power into concrete policy outcomes, and convince other African states to accept its leadership as beneficial for the whole region. The country would also have to demonstrate strong ideational appeal within the region, allowing it to build conditions that promote core norms and values and help stabilize the continent through the provision of public goods, particularly economic development and mechanisms to maintain security and order. Now, if you look at this exposition by the author of this book, it's very clear that the South African government's foreign policy in Africa has failed. It's failed, first, the cutting edge of its foreign policy, which is the military, because of the instability in Africa. The ANC has destroyed the South African military. I was reading somewhere a few days ago that the World Bank recommendation of military spending is 2% of gross domestic product. South Africa's spending, military spending, is 0.07% of gross domestic product. The consequence of this is we're getting our army being hammered by the Rwandans in the Eastern DRC. So South Africa is not a military leader in Africa. If anything, it's a liability to Africa. We need a strong military in South Africa. Instead, we have these old people's army. The average age of a South African soldier, I am told, is 40 years old. The average age of an American private is 19 years old. Now, it just shows you all the Air Force of South Africa is grounded due to lack of maintenance. We have soldiers in the Eastern DRC, they don't have attack helicopters to protect them, but we have the helicopters, but they are not maintained. So South Africa has failed as a leader in Africa. What has succeeded about South Africa is the economic leadership by the private sector of South Africa. That is what is, but it's not due to any help from the ANC government. The Standard Bank is one of the largest banks in Africa. ShopRite is one of the largest retailers in Africa, and so on. And these companies, and I can go on and on. MTN is one of the largest, if not the largest, cellular phone company in Africa. Vodacom is another one. So it's been the private sector in South Africa. About the academia, not being an academic, I would like to hear from the two professors there, what role of leadership are the academics providing to Africa? Have I spoken too much, Mr. Chairman, or do you want me to stop?
Listen, Becky, you were the respondents to the two panelists, but your comments are so thought-provoking. I almost immediately want to go back to the panelists to get their responses to your response on. But Mr. Becky, I think for the time being, what we'll do is we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience, following which we'll take 3 to 4 questions from the audience. I will then provide an opportunity to our two panelists, as well as to you, Mr. Becky, to respond to these questions. And then we'll take subsequent rounds in that order up until about 12:15. With that being said, I would first actually like to maybe go to the online audience and call on my colleague, Khadiagala. If any questions have popped up in the comments section, please could you relay them to us, to the panel. Thank you.
We actually have a lot of questions.
Okay, I think Khadiagala, please take a stand just in the middle here for the camera. That's
okay. I'm gonna keep it to 4 for now.
perfect.
Yeah, the first question was about whether there are any radical policies. I think this one's been answered, so I'll move it. Any insight on how GNU will impact the future of Africa-EU partnership? Whether SA has been traditionally positioned to be part of the non-aligned group, and what's going to happen with regard to that with GNU. And then SA plays a crucial role as G20 hosts for next year. As hosts, how can they influence the agenda on many issues, including health, climate, socioeconomic development, and how will agenda setting play out with the GNU cabinet? And then, do you foresee a world war or greater regional conflagration when Israel attacks Lebanon later this month, as it has announced? Where will SA position itself, and how will GNU survive given the different positions internationally? I think that I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Khadiagala. Professor Hendricks, Khadiagala, Mr. Mbeki online. I think I'll run through in the order that we've been speaking. I think a lot of these questions come back to the broader themes we've been discussing this morning about South Africa's leadership role in Africa. I think Mr. Mbeki also, the broad theme of some of his comments was the abject failure of some of that leadership in certain respects. But I think when it comes to issues like the chairing our presidency of the G20 in 2025, this is a key platform, a key stage for South Africa to showcase its leadership, to exert the kind of global influence for the African continents in this forum, even though we have the AU who is for the first time participating in these meetings. We also have the questions relating to this non-alignment issue. And I think that's a very interesting question because it also speaks to the internal party-specific dynamics and arrangements within the GNU that are very ideologically diverse and divided on certain respects. Prof. Hendricks, maybe I'll get your broad set of reflections first and then we'll proceed.
I'm reminded of the caption of South African being a reluctant hegemon. We used to debate this all the time. And I think it's still largely that, it is placed in this position, but it does not quite just assume it. It's always wanted to work on the basis of consensus, get the broader buy-in. But it's actually losing its credibility as a leader because it no longer has the skill set needed in terms of mediation, in terms of diplomacy, in terms of defense, etc. Really, we're going to have to invest much more if we want to play that kind of leadership role. Secondly, I think that there are other actors that have come to the fore. Everybody tells us in a multipolar world, but what it means for us on this African continent is that other actors, the Middle East, China, Turkey, Germany, etc., they're all coming in to have this role on peace diplomacy. And Rwanda for us is of particular interest because it is positing itself as the peacekeeper in Africa. In terms of African countries, a role that we occupied, but we certainly don't have that any longer. In terms of academics, before, I think, under Mbeki, there was much more engagement with academics. Before they would go and take particular positions. That has not happened in years. So I think that is where the breakdown is coming. It's not as if academics don't have points of views, that they can't be assisting here, but I don't think that engagement is there any longer. And hopefully within a GNU, which is broader multi-stakeholder inputs that can come in here, that relationship can be rebuilt again. South Africa, I think, because of the agency's dominance in international relations, as rightly pointed out, this is the African National Congress. Fonteh. They will stick to a non-aligned movement position. That will come through very clearly. Yes, it will be contested, but I think that will still win the day. In terms of moving into the G20 next year, here's again a key opportunity for us. But we have to get together to say, what do we want out of that particular position? What are the key things going in there? Not just for South Africa, because we represent the continent at that particular forum? Are we getting together internally and with the African counterparts to say exactly what do we want out of that particular role? Don't think that is happening.
Prof. Khadiagala?
The fundamentals of South African foreign policy are not going to change. And those fundamentals, I think, as we've been stating here, are progressive internationalism. There'll be some slight changes on what that means, but it still remains very much anchored in what you call the culture of the South. The non-aligned movement, very critical actor, and I don't think that there's going to be any disagreements within the GNU on those kinds of engagements. The issue around leadership is very fundamental, but leadership speaks to resources. I think the big debate between the ANC and the DA on issues such as intervention is where is the money coming from? And why can this money be spent on domestic priorities? So that is the big difference between the DA, or let me say the opposition parties and the ANC on how to exert leadership. Because if you don't have the resources, if you live on a shoestring budget, you're not going to provide the kind of leadership that I think Mlweti is talking about. So I can understand the issue about the defense, or the bad stories about the Navy, that the Navy doesn't exist anymore. It was one of the best navies in this part of the world. But these are issues that have to be negotiated within Parliament. Parliament has to decide whether South African foreign policy are going to be in these kinds of engagement, the kind of leadership roles that we want to assign South Africa. My reading of it is that I think the 30 years have been a creative time for the ANC to get South Africa back to Africa. South Africa was an alien nation in Africa. And it's just taking time for the ANC to forge a policy that says we are actually an African power. And that has taken time. The mobilization of resources around that is another issue. And I think that's why the issue around hegemony becomes a bit problematic here. I have suggested that South Africa can lead better in Africa when it works with core African players. And I think that is also still very much missing here. We had the kind of creative alliances with the Nigerians, with Algerians at some point, but I don't really see that featuring in foreign policy. How do you build partnerships with the rest of Africa? Because it's a complex continent and you need to work with others, which leads me therefore to the G20 issue. The AU is now a member of the G20. What kind of partnership is South Africa going to forge with the AU in actually presenting what you call an African position or an African global position, particularly if we look at the G20 as an important player? I think I've sat in with some discussion, with some people discussing how South Africa can work with the AU or whether their interests, in fact, will begin to collide. But I'm suggesting here, I think it's a very good opportunity for South Africa to begin to engage the AU more creatively, particularly since the AU is trying to negotiate a so-called common African position that they are going to present at the G20. Because they can't just go to G20 and sit there and listen and drink wine. We have to have very, very creative positions. And I think South Africa, given that it's already in the G20, can provide that kind of leadership.
No, I'm really glad the issue of parliaments actually came up again, like you mentioned, because, in this past week, we've actually seen from the Rules Committee in parliaments, the numbers increasing of certain subcommittees, the international relations one being one of them. And also given the fact that the composition of each of these subcommittee or portfolio committees, is a reflection of the seats within the National Assembly, it completely changes the composition and power dynamics within each of those subcommittees, who the chairs are, the relationship between the chairs, the members, and of course the minister and the deputy minister and the DG when they brief Parliament. So I think all of these issues that we're discussing now, G20, non-aligned movement, are going to be negotiated, discussed, and approached in quite a different way than we had, again, I hate to say, in the 6th administration or the 5th administration. Mr. Mbeki, the floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, okay, so I'm not quite sure where my intervention is needed, but you said that for me, keeping on the theme of the failure of our diplomacy, an example is the relation between South Africa and the United States. And the United States is a big power, so you have to have a relationship with it. Now, during the struggle against apartheid, the American people eventually got mobilized. Both the Republicans and the Democrats eventually passed over a veto by President Reagan, passed a sanctioned law against the apartheid regime. What happened after the ANC came to power? It ignored that whole constituency. So that's why and it ignored the constituency that had built up in the United States in support of South Africa. Now, the only other country with a constituency like we had in the United States, ironically, is Israel. But Israel keeps its constituency and it makes sure that it pays attention to it. It interacts with its constituency in the United States. Now, the continuity issue that we have been talking about is that's why personally I'm very concerned that if under the government of national unity we're going to have a continuity of ANC dominance in foreign policy, then we're going to continue with the failure. And this to me is a problem. The other parties are marginally interested. The DA only interested in passing. I agree with Khadiagala. South Africa has a culture of the South, and it is an African country. But it must, South Africa, we're all playing a role in BRICS and in the G20 and so on. But what role are we playing in Africa? Very little role are we playing in Africa in reconstructing the African continent. And to me, that is the failure of South Africa. If we look at our education systems, what is our interaction between our universities and the universities in the rest of Africa? What role are we playing there? I don't know, but I don't see it in the public media being reflected. You know, in our schools, how much of African scholars from the whole continent, including us, are actually used in our textbooks or in our reading material in our universities, in our high schools. I don't know, but these are the issues to me that are fundamental to the future of prosperity of South Africa. And not, I think in South Africa we spend too much time talking about political parties and their leaders, not about the welfare of the people of South Africa and the welfare of the country and the development of the country. Policies by the government must be directed at developing the welfare of the country, the strength of the economy and contributing to overcome the challenge of colonialism left behind for us. A couple of weeks ago, the South African Institute of International Affairs held an international conference about the problems of raising affordable capital on the world market. Now, what role is South Africa playing? South African economy, South African policies have allowed the South African economy to be junked, to lose its investment standing. Now, that is not helping Africa. But nobody is challenging the ANC government on these failures. We are now grey listed. This is badly affecting the reputation of the African continent. I'll stop there, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Mbeki. Colleagues, at this point, I'd like to open the floor to our in-person audience. Again, there's no need for a roaming microphone, as we have microphones in our ceiling, and our online audience can hear you just fine. If I may just ask you, when I call on you, to just stand up, introduce yourself, and pose your question. So can I have hands if anyone would like to ask? I see my colleague Ottilia, Prof. Wekesa, and at the back as well. Aditi, did you also have a question? No. Okay. Ottilia, please.
I'll ask Aditi's question for her. I'm kidding. Colleagues, thank you so much. I think first, just a preliminary thought, which is we are now in what is the constitutional design, not the exception. So this idea that GNUs will need to be short or whatever has to be thrown away, because the constitutional design is for cooperative governance. It's not a party political constitutional design. I think that matters. It matters domestically, and then it also matters internationally, that all that we're talking about now is the future. It's the present now, but it's the way it's going to go. And it's why South Africa or South African individuals within government and otherwise went to Denmark, went to the Netherlands, went to Sweden, went to Germany before this election, because they were looking at systems similar to our own, systems that require people to work together, which then brings me to my question, which goes away from the international and the continental a little bit, but focuses more within SADC, right, within the Southern African region, around the range of issues that can be covered on foreign policy. But I would be interested to know from the panel the direction on migration, on human rights, and on justice and accountability within SADC. Also, if you have reflections more broadly, but I think specifically to our region, I'd be interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Ottilia. Just again, migration, human rights, governance, and security.
Justice and accountability. Security has been discussed already.
Thank you very much, Ottilia. Prof. Wekesa?
Right. Thanks to the panelists. I have several questions, but I'll focus on one. And this is really the geopolitical question. I just wonder what the panelists will have to say about the fact that the relations between South Africa and the United States had reached, or has at this point in time reached its lowest ebb. Congress has called for the review of the relations. South Africa was almost thrown out of the African Growth and Opportunity Act. And there's just, lots of unhappiness in Washington, D.C., almost across the aisle among Republicans and Democrats on South Africa. On the other hand, we have the BRICS nations, and I want to just focus on one particular BRICS nation, China, which has a big stock of trade and economic assets here, including in the mining sector. It has been involved in infrastructure projects, including Transnet, and is now seen as an ally, a very close ally of South Africa and vice versa. How does the GNU approach these two splits? And of course, on a broader ideological global level, we have a situation where China is contesting the global governance infrastructure. And there are many examples: the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, which I think we'll see play out in September. On the other hand, the US is a status quo power which wants to maintain the same architecture and so forth. So here we have a split, and now we have a GNU. It was not quite contested when ANC was, had the full reign, but now it has to negotiate. I'll be very happy to hear what your thoughts are. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Yes, please sit back.
So my name is Tana Makoka. I had two questions, but I was wondering if I can also just add on to what Atilia was asking about SADC, and also ask the panel to maybe comment on food security as well in the Southern African region. And what do you think South Africa could contribute to SADC in terms of addressing that? My first question is actually to Prof. Hendricks about the prospects for feminist foreign policy, given that we now have a male minister again. But also I'm just thinking about how many of the conflicts, Ethiopia, Sudan, and even in Gaza, we're seeing conflict-related sexual violence become a key issue. And how can we link what we're doing, for example, with the ICC and ICJ cases in Gaza and that issue as well? And then for anybody on the panel, Prof. Hendricks, you spoke about the DA being more focused on perhaps trade. So South Africa has now taken the EU to the WTO dispute settlement mechanism on the citrus fruit phytosanitary issue. I just wanted to know from you how that will play out in terms of contestation between different parties of the GNU, given that also the citrus growing region is predominantly in the Western Cape. And then also, what does that mean for what Dirk has been saying about wanting to reform global governance, looking at, the international financial architecture, and the EU being a big player in that as well, and the WTO being a big player, and how, at the last ministerial conference, USA basically blocked being able to reform the dispute settlement mechanism. So yes, I've said a lot of things. You'll respond as you see fit. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So colleagues, there was quite a lot of questions. So I think we'll take those, but we'll definitely do another round of questions following this. Prof, there's a lot of questions here. Maybe I'll leave it to you to tackle in whichever order you'd like. I like the comment about the feminist foreign policy, because extra points to anyone who can say who was the last Minister of International Relations that wasn't a woman, but I'll leave, we know the answer. But so, Prof, yes, I won't dictate the terms of how to answer.
Okay.
Oh, if you'd like to start, Prof.
No, I just wanted to respond to Atilia that I think your prefatory remarks are very much to the point, that cooperative governance, I think this is not the last GNU. This is not the last GNU. I think we are entering a phase where you'll have to have more of this. And I like the idea of, Scandinavia or the German, because those are coalition governments, but they are more structured and institutionalized. So maybe something to learn from that. And I think that's an important issue here. On SADC, I think when Mlesimbeku was talking about abdication of leadership in Africa, I think SADC is the best case, because the things you have mentioned, the human rights, justice, and reconciliation, when we talk about that in respect to SADC, we talk about the SADC court. You remember how that story went? Because there are countries in SADC that have veto powers over some of these very soft issues, human rights issues, the justice issue, including Zimbabwe itself. So this is probably the best place for South Africa to exercise leadership, to say, we need normative frameworks in this region that work. And you need to actually be more strong, more forceful about those principles. Otherwise, SADC remains simply a shell, when it comes to issues around human rights. And I think, it would have been a good opportunity for South Africa at least to say, SADC, intergovernmental institution, but we can do better and push that line, and we see where it ends. But so I'm just thinking the current configuration of SADC, those issues are very much not on the agenda at all. Bob's question on, the US, as I said, it will be very hard to predict what happens in November, but if there is a Trump administration, and then I don't even think we're going to have these discussions on AGOA anymore, and not just the South African component, but the broader African component, because this would have to be discussed by a Congress that is going to be very skeptical, particularly if you don't have the leadership from the executive branch. So that's my the problem. It's not out of the woods yet. South Africa is not out of the woods yet because we really don't know when the negotiations for the AGOA renewal are going to happen. And they won't happen this year. They'll have to happen next year. On China, my response is South Africa has not sufficiently explained to the US why China is important. I think they need to confront the US and tell them, this is one of the biggest trading partners. These are global leader in technology. There are things that if they are explained, then these kinds of wars that keep going on between the US and China, South Africa, why are you so close to China? Why are you so close to Russia? These things are, I think my point is that the more transparent you are, the more transparent foreign policy is, the easier. So that when you come up with a counter argument, or the US comes up with a counter argument, then you know how to respond. But there's a lot of opacity in foreign policy that hinders those kinds of discussions. And that's why we're talking about if there is a shift in foreign policy, it has to begin from a conversation around what are our national interests. And those have to be negotiated over time. I don't even see the negotiations ending within the 5-year time frame, because we need that big document that defines what every other administration that is going to come up next GNU or whatever, to at least live to these key principles. And some of those is defining exactly who are South Africa's friends and telling your enemies that these are my friends. There was a question on food security. Almost all these countries now have declared food emergencies. The drought this year from last year. So it's a very dire situation, and it's going to get worse this year with the rains coming up. So, but SADC has tried at least to forge some positions on food security. But as I said, also these are resource issues. Who is going to come up with the resources, in fact, to feed all those Zambians? All these countries are affected very adversely by climate change and therefore food insecurity.
Thanks, Prof. And before I go to you, Prof. Hendricks, the question on food security is a great question, because I think it also highlights to us, again, with this new administration that we have, that the foreign policy, our conception of this foreign policy establishment extends far beyond DIRCO, not just to Department of, it also goes to Department of Energy, is it Energy and Electricity, and Mineral Resources and Petroleum. So we have this larger constellation of actors working on the Just Energy Transition Partnerships that has to coordinate with the DIRCO DG on. So there's a lot for us to consider. And I think our next big focus, I think from our side here as a think tank and as researchers, is the policy, the Kotla, or the conference that, and I think that's where we'll need to pay a lot of attention. Sorry, Prof. Hendricks, over to you.
I want to go back to this question of leadership in the African continent. We all know soft power and hard power, our defense, economy, etc., is what gives us that kind of, or what gave us the idea that we could be leaders on the continent. But that leadership is always contested, and partly why we've been so reluctant. Egypt, Zimbabwe here, Nigeria, that leadership has always been contested, partly why South Africa has not just simply gone gung-ho into the continent, and why the need for partnerships in the way in which Mbeki approached it by bringing in Senegal, Nigeria, etc., to reset the values of the continent, the African Union itself, etc. So that partnership is needed again. South Africa can't do this on its own. On this continent, credibility has been shot, and no government of national unity is going to just bring that back. So let's put that to rest. Secondly, on the issue of migration, I actually went to go and read the DA's policy on migration, and it's not too bad a policy. They're actually calling for free movement of people, that we need to attract skills. It's not a fear-mongering policy. And so I was pleasantly surprised by that, and glad then that Home Affairs is in the DA portfolio. I think we can, South Africa was one of the countries that was pushing back on free movement of people within SADC. So that to me is quite interesting there. On women, peace and security, and you can get me going, you know that, right? Because if anything that was lost during the formation of this government of national unity, it was the gender representation in parliament and in cabinet. They were prepared to do away with that, no compromising there, and hold on to positions of power. And yes, we have always been leaders on women, peace and security agenda in the UN, in AU, in SADC. We've had for the longest while women as ministers of defense, of international relations. It didn't make a difference to the gendered relations within those organizations itself. Feminist foreign policy. So South Africa has been a bit reluctant to even produce another foreign policy. We have a draft foreign policy, right? We don't have a revised foreign policy that has been adopted by cabinet. The National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security speaks to the need to review our foreign policy from a feminist perspective. I've had these conversations at DIRCA. There's no appetite for that at the moment. But we have 11 countries now that have adopted feminist foreign policies. I disagree with the way in which they're approaching feminist foreign policy, i.e. that we will reduce it to gender representation in terms of ambassadors, etc., and not deal with the power relations, because feminism is about shifting power relations and not just gender power relations, and we don't go there. So will South Africa be adopting a feminist foreign policy? I doubt it. Would it still be pushing the women, peace and security agenda at the UN? Yes, I do believe it will do so. But that women, peace and security agenda, just like the peace and security agenda at large, needs to be completely rethought, not just reset. And you know my thoughts on this, Khadiagala. We are very reformist in our approaches. When we talk about reforming the UN, what exactly are we talking about? Adding more seats? Sticking to the charter? We're not even questioning whether we can reopen a discussion on the charter itself of the UN. I like to make the point that we keep talking about conflict contexts and conflict actors having changed. When they change and our institutions can no longer respond to that, we have to rethink the actual institutions themselves. And we are not going there. We are not going there in relation to the AU, to SADC, or to the UN. We want to keep it as is and simply tinker within it. And I don't think that that is going to be sufficient right now. We really need the summit of the future to begin to open up the debate more fully to some of those basic principles that we hold dear in international relations. For example, sovereignty. Let's open up a discussion on this going forward. Why are these holy grails? Yeah, let me rest my case there.
Thank you, Prof. Mr. Mbeki, do you have any responses to the discussion so far?
Yes, hello. Not really. I mean, as you know, I'm not a panelist. I'm just a respondent. But again, the issues of food security, these are continent-wide challenges that have to be addressed. Africa is a net food importer. And why is this the case? But South Africa is a net food exporter. So those are the dynamics that we have to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Let me turn again to my colleague, Khadiagala, for any questions that may have come through from the online audience.
Yes, we've got quite a few. First is this grand coalition likely to follow the global norm with a stronger emphasis on actual national interest politics? This might manifest in the form of a stronger position against destructive forces like ZANU-PF.
So, sorry, Khadiagala, can you maybe just...
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay. Is the grand coalition likely to follow the global norm with stronger emphasis on actual national interest politics? This might manifest in a form of a stronger position against destructive forces like ZANU-PF and smaller border controls. And what are your views on how SA would frame its foreign policy to address the issues caused due to the expansion of the membership of BRICS? What initiatives would it take to augment SA's influence and role in voicing issues of the Global South? And then with regard to Mr. Mbeki's assertion that SA should really assert itself as a more prominent African leader, I want to ask, how would this relate to the typical Ubuntu African culture? Because I see many attempts to apply Ubuntu ethics in international politics in Africa, and with its preference for consensus rather than some leaders playing a prominent role. And then I'll take the last one now. Is it accurate for Mr. Mbeki to state that the ANC government has failed Africa, whereas presence of SA's private sector is visible on the continent? Is it possible to completely isolate the success of private from government to build stronger and closer relations with African countries? Is the private sector not a beneficiary of an enabling environment created by government through bilateral and multilateral mechanisms on the continent? I'll take one more if you don't mind.
It's quite a few. Okay, last one.
Okay. If SA has it seems SA has an inferiority complex in Africa and hasn't really overcome the awkwardness post-94 against its African peers. Having said that, globally, or should I say in the South, SA's reputation has been enhanced by its intervention at the ICJ. It should utilize its wave of positivity to forge deeper ties in creating alternative global bodies, given the failure of the UN.
Thanks, Khadiagala. So colleagues, we'll just do this round of questions. We'll do a final one with our in-person, and we will then move into closing remarks. So I think that there was quite a lot of questions there that came through. Just to recap, running through it backwards, I think we have this issue relating to superiority/inferiority complex with South Africa. I think, Prof, for many of us who looked at the different phases of South Africa of our foreign policy under different past administrations, I think we can definitely highlight the fact that, in the late 90s, early 2000s, South Africa was playing this very visible and active role in, number one, underwriting the costs of continental institutions on peace and security, playing an active technical role in peace support operations, in mediation and peace building and so on. And we've seen the waning and waxing of South Africa's role and throughout many years. And I think where we are right now, touching on our interventions in the DRC, in Mozambique, clearly there are some challenges. And I think the second point is that apart from the on-the-ground challenges, is there enough coherence in our foreign policy to fit these on-the-ground interventions into a broader strategic objectives that we're trying to pursue on the world stage? And I think that leads me to the other question that came through around national interest. Will this coalition arrangement, this governance arrangement, push through perhaps a more, I don't know what's the word, assertive foreign policy in which we assert or express our national interest? Again, I'll leave that to you, given the fact that we've all, I think, all agreed that the broad contours of our foreign policy are not going to change too much. But I think this is speaking more to maybe the character of our foreign policy over the coming 5 years, the innate, the way in which we conduct it. So again, I'll leave it to you. We had questions on South Africa's, again, role in the global south and BRICS and the role that we should be playing. I really like the fact that someone in the online audience mentioned Ubuntu, the foreign policy or diplomacy of Ubuntu from many years ago, the white paper that we had. I think it'll be interesting to hear your reflections on maybe that white paper. And if we had to read that white paper today, in the year 2024, has that white paper found much expression in our foreign policy? Has it translated and adapted to the times in our foreign policy? And what is the utility of Ubuntu as a defining foreign policy feature over the next 5 years? The question on the ANC's, some of the failures and challenges that was addressed directly to Mr. Mbeki, I think we'll earmark that one for Mr. Mbeki when we get to it. Colleagues, I'll start with you. Maybe Prof. Khadiagala?
I think the early 90s were a moment of optimism for Africa. And the promise of governance and human rights and all this. So it was a good context in which South Africa really entered into the continent, as I use that word, became a leader because there was just broad optimism about where Africa was going. But that is very different from the current context because it still hinges on how solidly the African governments can govern themselves, African countries can govern themselves. And I don't think that's the responsibility of South Africa. South Africa is there to provide a role modeling of sorts, which it did actually in the early 90s. But given the kind of pessimism around governance in Africa in general, I mean, we are not done very well on that in that respect. So I can understand why even South Africa itself would be very cautious in engaging with those kinds of issues where you don't want to deal with an Africa that is it's array. I think you want South Africa should deal with an Africa that is confident of itself, that can manage a lot of these problems without external actors. I think on issues like the DRC, for instance, again, the issue, going back to the abdication of leadership, I don't know why South Africa doesn't sit with Mr. Tshisekedi and in fact try to say, this conflict in the East, maybe you need to begin to resolve it differently because we had an intervention force there. You remember in 2013, And now there is a new SADC force, a more expanded SADC force, but I don't think it's actually making that much of a difference on the ground. So it would appear that institutions such as SADC are institutions that South Africa could use actually to begin to make more noises about different approaches to this conflict. You can make the same point about Mozambique. Why hasn't it invested in an army that works? Why hasn't it addressed the grievances of the northerners, the people in Cabo Delgado? So there are opportunities that South Africa could still exercise in actually contributing to the stabilization of Africa in general. On the issue of national interest, I think what I said from the beginning was this is a moment to translate, to define that national interest, to be defined not in 5-year term white papers or blue papers, but an abiding document that defines what is it that South Africa wants. But as I said, you need a bigger domestic buy-in for that kind of national interest, because it's also going to define what are the priorities. And if there are these priorities, then what kind of resources do we actually expend on these priorities? But the Ubuntu and all these other big documents, my suggestion is that they just be rewritten. Because Ubuntu, who can disagree with Ubuntu? As I said, who is against Pan-Africanism? But that's not enough. That's not enough. I think we have to go from there and define exactly how South Africa should position itself on these various issues. So what I'm looking for is some clarity on what I'm calling the national interest-based foreign policy. And then the Ubuntus and the Pan-Africanism can just be really the overarching frameworks of those policies. But there is need for some interesting definition of what it means for South Africa to be in Africa, for South Africa to be at the UN. And I like your point about the UN. Are we still talking about UN reforms, UN Security Council reforms? Maybe that's an agenda that is not as important now. I don't know. Because you can't have that discussion unless you have a bigger discussion about the democratization of the UN Security Council itself. So you're just simply going to invite other new members and you're going to continue the same. So I don't know whether that can be a South African priority anymore, because I don't even think that priority is really on the African agenda. It's occasionally African heads of state refer to it. But it's actually one of the priorities that I would argue is not as significant. On the BRICS, I was very skeptical about the BRICS from the outset. But my point was that you have a lot of actors who have a lot of grievances among themselves. How do you cohere the BRICS? But it looks like it has innovated and there is some coherence there. But my position was that South Africa should not be too overexposed to some of the agendas within BRICS. I think BRICS has a good objective, trade and all these very, very civilizational issues. But I think the political baggage of BRICS does not help South African foreign policy. So that's how my reading of it is important, but use it more creatively. And don't overexpose yourself on unnecessary grievances, particularly US-Russia debates or China-Russia debates.
Thank you, Prof. Hendricks?
In relation to BRICS, I thought last year, just listening to some of the debates within that meeting in BRICS, South Africa was trying to play a more moderating role between the polarized positions. And I thought that was a very interesting role also for South Africa to begin to steer within that particular institution. We started this discussion noting the differences between our focus of the other political parties on domestic issues and ANC having a very clearly defined international relations policy. The gap, I think, is that the ANC and government at the time, Sixth Administration, did not do too much people-to-people relations in Africa. So it concentrated on party-to-party relations and on its bilateral relations and, entering into multilateral institutions. It did absolutely nothing, I think, on people-to-people relations. And the consequence has been this kind of backlash that we have seen in terms of xenophobia, in terms of international relations and the Africa agenda not being a priority for many of South Africa. So it has to do better there, I think. This superiority, inferiority that you refer to, we have a challenge in South Africa, a real challenge around capacity. We are not investing in building the capacities, as I indicated before, of our people in relation to mediation. Yes, for DIRCO trains on mediation, it has a capacity building program. It's not sufficient for the kinds of engagements that we have to go into there. On diplomacy, etc. We have to do way more in terms of upskilling our people more broadly, not just DIRCO and defense, academia as well. I see very few South African international relations experts also coming. You can't still be hauling us to podiums. Well, there needs to be a new generation. There's that idea. So we need to see way more of that. And we need to see more of the interaction between our intellectual class and our political class going forward there. For national interest, there's no such thing, I think, as just a national interest. There are many different interests that play themselves out. Which one of these is going to prevail in South Africa in this GNU is, I think, what the question is. And that's, I guess, a discussion that we will have to have for another time. Many different actors in foreign policy. Moletsi was talking about the private sector. They a huge actor in foreign policy, but in international relations out there now. South Africa is being perceived through the eyes of what it is doing with ShopRite and Web and Mnet, etc. Also there. So there's a lot of thinking to conclude. There's a lot of rethinking that has to be done. Both in South Africa, we produce this national interest document. It's there. Nobody knows what's in it, but it is there, right? And I think if one reads it, there's also this wanting to just emphasize economic diplomacy and not the peace diplomacy. So if you read the Ubuntu document, it's more on peace diplomacy. If you read the national interest document, it's more on economic diplomacy. And we have to find each other somewhere because we have a role to play on both those aspects.
Thank you, Prof. And I think it's so interesting. It was just last year, was it the year before, where we did actually, DIRCO did undertake quite a comprehensive process with regards to this national interest framework documents. And, there is a lot of work that has been done, but is it translating into policy or, real tangible actions? And I think it'll be very interesting for us to assess over the course of this seventh administration. And Prof, also the point you mentioned on training and mediation, we have this amazing tool, the African Renaissance Fund, that separately reports to parliaments, it is my hope, at least, that, in this new arrangements or parliamentary arrangements that we have, the portfolio committees play a much more robust role, because I think, if we had to look at the DG's reports on the ARF or DIRCO or whoever in general, we'd often find that at the end of every year, close to 100% of all targets are met. And, Parliament, but really, are we achieving some of those targets? What are those targets? I think there's a role for us to play, maybe more broadly as civil society, as academics, as researchers, to interrogate those nitty-gritty, finer details on how budgetary allocations are made towards training, mediation. Is it in line with the broader strategic goal of the African Renaissance Fund and so on? So I'm glad that issue has come up as well. Colleagues, in the interest of time, I will take a final round of questions from our in-person audience. They don't necessarily also have to be questions. It can be general comments. And Khokelo, if there have been more online questions, we won't entertain all of the questions. I think it'll just be food for thought for us to digest once we conclude this session. But let me first come to our online audience. I see Tali from Ubuntu Radio, my colleague over there. No one else? Okay, Tali, we'll start with you.
All right. Thank you so much, and very informative discussions. And I'm glad that the panels also have given themselves to engage us on Ubuntu Radio as well. So thank you so much, Prof. Just in terms of just how hotly contested this election was. So now the question is, leading up to 2026 local government elections, do you think that most political parties will be more concerned with domestic priorities because they still need to find themselves in that position where they're able to make influence and also build up to actually occupy position of influence in the local communities where international relations issues are not so much dominant in our local communities? Then how do they converge the two to say we are also interested on issues that you are much concerned about, but I mean, maybe focus on more the issues that they can easily agree on as far as foreign policy is concerned, the issues of migration, like as Prof said in terms of migration, where the Democratic Alliance have made pronouncement to say, let's open the country as far as skills labor is concerned, but also others say, no, let's rather look at what we can do domestically. That you think that the political parties will work on more issues that they can easily agree on, given the ANC's capacity, historic capacity in its international relations orientation, that they would rather leave some of the issues that easily they can find each other on as far as the orientation is concerned. Just in terms of looking at what do you think will be the priorities, but also do you think that the domestic priorities will be much more focused than international relations issues? Thank you.
Thank you, Tali. Adibao?
Good morning, everyone. I am Adibao, and I just have a question for the panelists. Just in your closing remarks, if you could please just reflect on how digital diplomacy will shape South Africa's foreign policy, and what strategic directions do you foresee South Africa for taking in this arena, and what are the key considerations that South Africa should focus on to effectively integrate digital diplomacy into its broader foreign policy framework? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adiba. Khokelo, if there's anything, yes, yeah, please. Sorry, I will come back to Khokelo.
My question is this: the impression I get from what you said already is that Parliament will have a bigger role around foreign policy in this round, and that given that you have this construct of this grand coalition, it does give a higher voice, I think. And John Schroep has already said it, that they're the official opposition. So the positive around that perhaps is a stronger push around Pan-African issues, possibly, and maybe some of the pushback on some of the issues around migration. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit and tell us what that could mean in practice.
You're directing it to? Anyway.
Here's the questions that, sorry, Priyal. The questions that I'm seeing here have already been answered.
Okay.
But I have one quick question.
Also,
With the DFFE having a DA minister, I mean, right now,
DFFE?
Department of Environment.
I'm a duck. I focus on duck.
I apologize. Where do you foresee South Africa's international commitment on climate going?
Thanks, Khadiagala. Profs, in any order?
On digital diplomacy, it was good to see a young communications minister being appointed there. So I think that they are taking that particular portfolio very seriously. It is the future. I think they will pay attention to it. I can't say the how, it's not something that I focus on, but I do think that this is going to play a much bigger role going ahead. In terms of domestic priorities versus international relations, given municipal elections in 2026, yes, there will be more of a focus on domestic priorities, but it also leaves the space wide open for DIRCO and the Office of the Presidency to go and do what they need to do in relation to South-South relations, etc. So I think there's also quite an opportunity there for them to shift. It is interesting. Parliament is going to play a much bigger role. You've mentioned it. I tried to indicate that as well. On the issue of migration and whether we will see a pushback there, for me, what is interesting is that they all kind of preface it is illegal migration. And that would mean that you need to go and clean up home affairs so that you get your documentation processing, etc., right, the corruption, etc. So it might not be that, no, we don't want, I don't even want to say foreign immigrants because it's Africans that they don't want to come in. It might be more of a focus on how do we ensure better governance in home affairs and clean up our systems, etc., to deal with that particular issue. For me, the backlash, and this is what I think in my closing remark, if I can do that now, we're concentrating on particular ministries, etc. We're not looking at our society and the power keg that's in our society. If we don't deal with the fundamental issues of inequality, of poverty, of unemployment, no matter who's in the government of national unity and their policies, that kind of fragmentation, if we have another July 2021 happening, and the possibility for that is there, we are seriously challenged. So we have to look at not just defense, we have to look at our Department of Intelligence as well, the capacities and skills there. A lot more to do than just focusing on political parties and government. Look what is happening in terms of social cohesion, fragmentation in our societies.
And we should look at our governments of provincial unities as well, I think.
Concept is that.
Prof. Khadiagala?
I think the GNU is going to rebalance foreign policy and domestic policy. Domestic priorities, I think, will be the priority of the GNU because of the mixture of parties around and because of the very appreciation of the issues that you're talking about. I mean, you have to address serious problems of inequality and so on. So I don't think foreign policy will remain, but I don't think it will be that big priority. And if Parliament is playing its role, and I like the fact that Parliament can play a role because Parliament ultimately should be the body that decides on those very priorities, whether you're talking about foreign policy or domestic policy. So that rebalancing, I think, is healthy because it's just a question of then how you distribute resources. And again, given that most of the opposition parties really are not interested in foreign policy. And so I can see them pushing really for a domestic-centered policy. But it's not bad because South Africa cannot remove itself from the world. And so foreign policy will keep intruding on South Africa. So the question would just be how it redefines it. On the issue of the decarbonization, the green transition, energy transition, I think there is money out there that has been plagued to South Africa. The question is whether, in fact, that can be, whether South Africa would move very quickly on that front, given the very huge problems there on energy and so on. So I see the dependence on coal really being something that it will be hard to give up coal, actually. And that is a key part of the just energy transition. So whatever the resources are in that port, I don't know how they are going to deal with the current imperatives of having to depend on coal at the same time you are moving towards a just energy transition. I think it's a very, very difficult balancing act. And so I don't really see much traction on it because of, I think, the domestic issues. I think you responded to the digital diplomacy. The more we have the young people taking over the reins of digitization, the more that is going to become prominent in foreign policy. And it's also a good thing.
No, thank you, Prof. And thank you to everyone for joining us this morning. It's been a truly fascinating discussion, and it's, of course, the first of many such dialogues we'll be engaged in over the next couple of months and years to come. I'd just like to take this opportunity specifically to thank Professor Hendricks, Professor Khadiagala, and of course to Mr. Mbeki, who's joined us online as a respondent and as well. Before we call this dialogue to a close, however, I'd like to just invite my colleague, Mr. Desigan Naidu, who's a senior research associate at the ISS, to provide a few closing remarks. The floor is yours, and you can speak at the podium. Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. First, to just reiterate Priyal's words, that it has been a rich discussion. And our intent at the ISS was to bring some of the issues up front and engage them, because we're going to need to have many discussions going forward on how we roll this out. And one of the things that South Africa can definitely use is a more public discussion on foreign relations issues, because we generally don't. So let me make just a couple of points, reinforcing what has been said already, of course. The first point I want to make is that judging the election manifestos as a primary instrument of expression of foreign policy clearly has its flaws. I mean, people write manifestos to run an election. That's its job, except for the ruling party, which has a different job. Now that many of these parties are in fact part of the ruling coalition, they clearly need to organize themselves to be much more pronounced and have a stronger philosophical base for foreign policy positions around this. And the places of expression are going to matter. So while a lot of the expression is in the traditional departments of trade and industry and foreign affairs and cooperation, it extends right across the board. I mean, Home Affairs is a foreign policy instrument, as is Environment, and the new Minister of Environment has already expressed himself on this issue, saying that, one, he reinforces the current positioning of South Africa around the carbon ambition, but two, maybe the timetable should be revised much in the direction that you're talking about, Gilbert. And some of us who play in that space are a little bit worried about that and what that could mean. But it goes beyond that as well, because, I mean, defense as an instrument, finance is becoming increasingly an instrument of foreign policy expression, as we have been seeing in the last 2 decades in particular. And then don't count out things like transport and sports, arts and culture. So we need to have a very well-informed cabinet on what the boundaries are, what the guardrails are around our foreign policy position. And it can't come sooner than now. The second thing I just want to put on the plate is that Gilbert talked about a monolithic policy, having the opportunity to become a little less monolithic, a bit more diverse, and more in touch with this wonderful thing called the national interest. I think that's true. I'm not too sure what it's going to be and how it's going to express itself, because the monolithic nature of our foreign policy to date has been mirrored. The government monolithic character has been, in turn, mirrored by a monolithic character in opposition. And this reflects how apartheid South Africa operated. So the liberation movements have a base that has been traditional and historic and have in many ways stuck to it, while the apartheid ruling party base has also stuck to its allies quite strongly. And we've seen this expression in just about every major conflict that we have had. How this tailors itself out into this new dispensation is going to be interesting. First has been the discussion that has already happened around Gaza, and there seems to be some toenaddering about that, not completely ironed out yet. The same discussion has not happened around Ukraine and many other hotspots that are emerging around the world. Of course, Gaza has the opportunity to expand into something a lot bigger on the back of a possible Lebanon strike. It also depends on what the new leadership is going to be in Iran. So us getting our story together is really, really critical, because if we're going to have knee-jerk reactions to all of these things, we're actually going to be in a lot more trouble than we may have been in the past. The second point that I just want to emphasize is the issue around South Africa's economic diplomacy. And although we talked about it a lot more about 2 decades ago, we might be doing more with it now than we have done before. But we are schizophrenic about it. So the running after the US around AGOA on the one side is completely different to the citrus challenge on the other side. Which is a very powerful South African expression, actually. And it's coming within a suite of things that are rather important. So you will know that China and a couple of other countries are now challenging some of the rules of the EU under the guise of researching the extent of the subsidies. South Africa's angle is a very different one. South Africa's angle is around whether or not the EU's interpretation of the current rules base is in fact scientific. And I think we're probably going to win that one. And that's going to set off a whole different dynamic. That maybe these will have a very positive impact around raising the bar on how we engage these issues inside South Africa. Of course, the big unknowns, as for now, are the things we have to worry about a little bit more than that. So one is the issue of Fortress Europe. It's already real, right? It might become even more real with the second round of the French elections, and of course the UK elections. We'll probably know tomorrow where that lands. And that characterization is going to organize itself to give expression to it. But it means things in 2 directions. So the more difficult things around Fortress Europe is going to be a probable increase in subsidies and the skewing of the market, while increasing the rules base around the tariffs on the one hand. On the other hand, there's a pretty good likelihood that it will change the timetable of the Green Deal. And that might be a breathing space for the African continent as a whole. So that's the space to watch. The other space to watch is of course, the US. And the US may be a bit scarier than before, because now with Project 2025, the Trump team is taking no chances around having a non-functional administration for 3/4 of the administration. They're going to hit it on day one, which means the impacts are going to be quite immediate. But let me close on just one point, because I know we're all going to carry this discussion with us to many other places. I want to talk about Africa in particular and South Africa's positioning. The first, as difficult as it is, I have to challenge Molet's. I think that at a time, South Africa, the new democratic South Africa, was quite instrumental in empowering a new definition for the African continent. And South Africa can take some credit to putting a lot of attention, some resources, and certainly a lot of policy investment in developing this instrument we now take for granted called the African Union. We did not sustain it. There are many reasons why we didn't sustain it. It is important now that we do and have that reinvestment. But I should also point out that the approach has to be more collegial. I'm not sure that South Africa should be talking about going in to lead the African continent or to leading SADC. I think that South Africa has got to take its place in the pantheon of responsibility and organize for a new Team Africa to emerge quite strongly. And the reasons for this are really sound. You know, to use two cliches, first of those cliches is that if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu. And we're seeing this in so many ways. I mean, we were having a discussion earlier with Stephen around how Africa's mining rights are being issued back and forth like nobody's business without any thinking about the strategy and what you're going to inherit in the longer term. So that's the first thing we have to worry about, and it's a very, very big worry. The second maybe is an opportunity, because, you know, we talk about being in a multipolar world, but the multipolar world is rapidly emerging into a bipolar characterization. And then the old African proverb, borrowed, I think, Gilbert, from your country, around when the elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers. Yeah? Well, maybe the grass can be a bit smarter this time. Maybe there is a lot of opportunity in the elephants fighting. And many of the things that we've been doing on the African continent, and with the emergence of a bunch of African countries that are now defying the odds and breaking the traditions with things like economic growth rates, might mean that if Africa is smart enough, we can use the opportunity to have a next level Africa on the back of the elephants fighting, perhaps. But it takes effort to do that, and it takes us into the space of making a very high investment in organizing a bunch of things, including the way we conceptualize this policy environment that we have to go into. So on that note, thank you all very much, both here and online. And we hope to be playing with you on the many other discussions that we're going to need to have in this space, including some of the leadership positions from developing countries and South Africa that we can use going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That concludes our discussion for today. We hope to keep on engaging, and we will see everyone very soon, hopefully. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.